Hello and welcome to another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action, a series where leaders look back at decisions they've made and consider a series of questions. I'm Peter Stiepelman, I'm your host, and I'm an imperfect leader. I spent more than 20 years teaching and leading, first in the Oakland Public Schools in Oakland, California, and then in the Midwest, Missouri to be exact, where I was a teacher and a principal and assistant superintendent and then the superintendent of the fourth largest district in the state. I'm constantly striving to learn from my experiences and from the experiences of other leaders. The aim of this podcast is to lift the learning and lift the imperfect leaders up. That way, when you hear the term imperfect, you'll see strength. Strength from the candor needed to recognize imperfection as a real advantage. Let's get started. It was in Hartford, Connecticut, where I saw my very first hockey game. The Hartford Whalers versus the New York Rangers. And what a scene it was. During the second period, there was an obvious offense. I didn't fully understand the game, but both benches cleared and both teams were absolutely brawling. I find myself in Hartford at least once a year, and so every year I revisit in my mind that really violent episode in my life. But now, after talking with my guest, Dr. Torres-Rodriguez, I have a delightful replacement memory, and for that, I am grateful. My mentor, Dr. Linda Henke, the creator of the human-centered school transformation that I speak so much about, wrote, "The shift away from the heroic leader who goes it alone to the transformational leader who attends to the field is perhaps the most fundamental change in the work of school leadership." And she continues by asking readers to rethink the metaphor of a leader as hero and consider instead a different metaphor, someone like a midwife or a gardener or a minister, someone who tends to the needs of others. My guest this week cares so deeply for her district because her district is so personal to her. She graduated from the district and then returned to lead it. She leverages the voices of her entire system, inside and outside the organization, including the voices of her children. She considers the technical skills, the emotional intelligence, and a lens focused on equity in order to make sound decisions. And she uses all of this knowledge and skill in recounting her after-action review, the recommendation to her board to consolidate or close schools in her school district. Thanks for tuning in. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez is my guest. Dr. Torres-Rodriguez is the superintendent of schools in Hartford, Connecticut, a school district with about 16,000 students. Dr. Torres-Rodriguez was named the 2022 National Superintendent of the Year by the Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents. She also received the 2019 Award for Educational Leadership from the Connecticut Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents, as well as the 2019 Prospanica National Brillante Award for Educational Excellence. Dr. Torres-Rodriguez is a member of the Governor's Workforce Council and serves on the Hartford Promise Board. She also co-chairs the Mayor's Cabinet for Young Children in Hartford. Leslie, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, so many accolades. And I have to say, I loved reading about you in the November issue of School Administrator magazine. You and I had two very different second days as superintendent. So you indicated that your best professional day was your second day on the job. And on that day, the Superintendent Student Advisory Council, they were trained in diversity, equity, and inclusion and participatory budgeting. And it was through their involvement that more school counselors were allocated to elementary and middle schools. And that was really important because these were high school students advising you, and they were already systems thinkers. They saw the existing inequity, and then they saw the benefits for kids and that they would have mental health services earlier in their lives. So my second day, the insurance company for the school district called me and said, look, you're going to have to install buzz-in systems at all your 4 high schools and or you're going to lose your insurance coverage. So, and I'm thinking high schools with this tradition of being completely open, and one of them built, over 100 years before that with so many entrances, and I much prefer your second day. So let's get back to your second day and every day before and every day since. As I have learned more about you, it's clear equitable budgeting practices is important to you. And so would you tell us just how do you craft a budget for the school district? And specifically, what are some components that perhaps you haven't seen in more traditional approaches?
So, Peter, first I have to kind of correct the record there that was my second year as superintendent.
Oh,
so I don't know how that it landed as like my second day.
I thought to myself, wow, she accomplished a lot in that first day.
for another perhaps series, we could talk about what that second day was really like. But
that makes me feel a little better.
No, yeah, absolutely. Certainly equity, resource allocation and equity within that process has been at the center of my leadership. And yes, we actually took a deep dive into our not only resource allocation, but the process. Folks will often hear me talk about process, equity in the what and equity in the how. And so how we go about achieving equity matters as well. And so I wanted to know what the experience is like from various stakeholders as to our resource allocation process and formula. And we heard several themes. And one of several themes was, of course, the inequity in the allocation itself. We had, for example, we operate in an ecosystem of school choice, and we had, unintended as it might have been, some magnet schools that were, for example, receiving $1,300 more per student than our neighboring neighborhood school. And so those were tactical moves that we could make, but I also wanted to leverage voice and also the opportunity for agency across all stakeholders. That's where the student piece came from, where they had the training. And then we leveraged the voices of our school leaders who told us, hey, this one needs to be a more transparent process. And as school leaders, we want to have agency and flexibility in how we allocate some of our resources. And then we have a structure for school governance councils where there are our educators, our family, parents, and community partners also get to inform the resource allocation.
That's really interesting to me because when I was superintendent, we brought in an individual's name was Nate Levinson. He's out of Boston area, and to come kind of help us think through how we were allocating. It seems like you've really put some interesting systems in place that particularly allow you to maybe establish tiers and tiers of support and those types of things. One of the pieces that he brought to us as we were trying to both centrally make some decisions as well as, to your point, recognize that at the building site, they know what's best for their buildings. And so how do you give them some agency to make some of those choices as well? So anyhow, I thought that was interesting. In the leadership model that I've been using to advise others, there's a dimension in there called the leader's learning work. And that's really the mind or the brains of the work. And inside that dimension, there's a term, applying systems and design thinking. And for most superintendents, designing and applying systems doesn't come naturally. We go from leading schools to leading then large, complex systems. And we've had to learn how to think about decisions we make and then the unintended consequences and what those decisions look like 3 years from now, 5 years from now. And we learn how to apply systems thinking tools. I recently talked with a superintendent on the podcast whose after action review was all around the pandemic. And at one point he mentioned absenteeism and how absenteeism existed before the pandemic, certainly, and how it has continued to be a real challenge for his school district. You noted something in the article about absenteeism, and I really honed in on this because you said, chronic absenteeism was a real challenge. 20% of kindergartners and ninth graders had chronic absenteeism. And then you led a community conversation. You literally went door to door. You added a student engagement specialist. You celebrated kids for improving their attendance. You saw a reduction in absenteeism. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. And so as I read about this, I thought to myself, let's really understand systems and the relationship between and among those systems, most notably between the district and its families. You just made mention of engaging families and including them in the budgeting process as well. I wonder, would you talk just a little bit about the importance of relationships and how you leverage relationships to help children succeed?
I would say it's a foundation in our approach. It is also at the center of our value set. We have to think about about 17,000 students, incredibly diverse community. We have to understand the challenges and of course, the strengths of all of our members. There's not a one size fits all when we're talking about equity and inclusion. That is why it's so complex. And there is an interdependency that I think sometimes we as leaders, as we try to move fast, overlook. And there are micro and macro systemic interdependencies that have to be mined and untangled at times. And we saw that with chronic absenteeism. And one of the things that I wanted to make sure is that we had a shared understanding. And by we, I mean clearly internally, but also the ecosystem. Because what we often think that chronic absenteeism is a symptom of what's happening in our schools, and there are reasons that are directly tied to what's happening, right? The student's experience or the lack thereof. But it is broader and more complex than that, and interdynamic. And so making sure that we had a community-wide, from not only parents, but service providers, health experts, and that we shared in the commitment to support and provide the conditions for students and our families, right, to be at their best. And we internally looked at our data systems, our processes, protocols. We did all that technical work. We had to also examine our value set around, providing students and meeting students where they were. And by extension, at times, their families. I've had colleagues that say to me, that is not the role of the school. And look, do I want to sit here and try to solve for all of the external systems? No. However, I can't ignore that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that there will be so many in a community that'll say that's not the role of the school. Your schools have a different function. And you would say, well, if we learned anything from the pandemic, it is that without the schools, how many inequities are exposed, whether it become nutrition to clothing, to supporting housing, to transportation, to mental health needs, to every bit of what was not considered the role of school and has absolutely become the role of school. I'm curious about when you talk about a student's experience, because we know that children will do everything they possibly can to get to school if, in fact, they feel that they are valued and honored and loved at school. We also know there are other pieces that will inhibit a child from coming to school. And so what did that partnership look like with families? What were some of the things you were learning?
Some of the things that we learned on multiple sides, and I mean that us at the school system, our families, our providers, our partners, our 4 and 5-year-olds, a 20% chronic absenteeism, 4 and 5-year-olds, is not a student issue, right? That is a familial, community-based challenge that had to be solved for. And so building understanding capacity, for example, for some of our families who had not experienced early education. And that was their first interaction with a school system and didn't really understand how important it was to be in school every day, for that 4 or 5-year-old to be in school every day. And so it meant literally showing some of our families what the experience was like and what their child would be missing. Of course, that plays out very differently in the 9th grade, another pain point for us when you think about chronic absenteeism. And so it allowed us to look at what are the transition supports that needed to be in place for students as they went into the middle grades and then as they transitioned to our high school grades. And then it was the system of supports that had to be in place, not only with regard to when students were transitioning and needing the academic supports, but that social, emotional, the relationship piece and truly building capacity across our schools as to developmentally from a human development, youth development perspective. What does it mean for a child to feel seen, right, valued and heard? What does it look like, sound like, and feel like developmentally, academically, socially, and then within the context of who they are as a person and their culture, their ethnicity, their community. So it is, we're still peeling, right, at the layers to get it right for our young people.
Yeah, so you're really speaking to the role of leaders and teachers and any adult. When I say teacher, I mean any adult who's in a building is considered a teacher in my mind in terms of what they bring to children, is establishing that cultural field. What does it look like, feel like, sound like? How do we know that we belong? Because if you feel like you're not part of that field, you will do almost anything to avoid it.
To stay away from it. Absolutely. And it's right. So that's human, right? And so it's not yes, students are at the core of it, but we have to model the practice that we want to see as leaders. And that's something that I constantly reflect on, right? What am I saying? What am I doing? What I am not saying and doing that communicates or not, right? The value set that I hold so high in service of our students.
Thank you. Leslie, I ask this question of every guest who comes on the podcast. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
I am probably my biggest critic is probably myself. And so that's a work in progress for me. Imperfect leader all the time. I reflect every morning when I wake up at 4:30 in the morning, right? So I reflect on the goals for the day before I go out to the gym. And then at night, and I think about what I felt I was short in and what I maybe over delivered that I was not thinking about. And then where I was kind of like in the middle. It is something that I've done for years. And I don't know what I would do as a leader if I didn't have that level of reflection as to why and why not. Like I didn't deliver for myself, and then I couldn't show up for others in that way. And now more than ever, when I think about the work that we have to do to reimagine education, and the fact that there has to be, let me see if tolerance is the word that comes up for me, for imperfection. And that's a tension for me. It's a tension because of the context in which I serve and lead in. There is no room for imperfection when it comes to delivering for kids, right, for our young people. Yet, when we think about the conditions that have to exist for us to really innovate, right, design thinking, it is about, right, leveraging the voice, leveraging the experience, a very personalized experience and engagement that will expose, right, those imperfections so that we can get at what we have to deliver on. And so that's what comes up for me, the tensions that I myself grapple with on a daily basis as I reflect on my own personal leadership, and then, right, the professional leadership that we're called to deliver in times that require significant redesign and innovation.
An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action is supported by ILAA, a firm dedicated to supporting aspiring new and established leaders. For more information, please find them at human-centeredleaders.com. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest is Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez, the Superintendent of Schools in Hartford, Connecticut. In this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision they had to make, and then we discuss it a little bit. So Leslie, what happened?
So I will tell you the decision was the way in which I had to approach ultimately getting at recommendations for the board to consolidate, right size our district. It was a very clear charge that I had, and it was up to me to go with the recommendations. And I thought, well, at the center of my leadership is voice, is equity. I also had to mind what it is that the community was experiencing or not, right, as members of this learning community. And so I made a decision to approach it actually from a design thinking perspective with deep engagement and an opportunity not just to listen, but to co-create and and co-imagine with our community. And it took about 6 months of deep engagement, most of those led by me. And I recall folks saying, "You're taking too long." And, it was one of those where, as a leader, radical acceptance to say, yes, it might be a long journey here, but at the end, right, this is not going to be my plan. This is going to be our community plan. And am I glad that we were able to maintain the integrity of the approach? And then through 3 years, right, we ended up consolidating 20% of the district of our schools, which that's a significant amount of disruption and change. But it meant that more than 2,500 of our students, for example, had access to high quality learning environments. In addition to our teachers having more opportunity for collaborative opportunities, right? Some of the things that we heard from our stakeholders, and that's in a very summarized fashion what happened. That I made the decision to pause and engage others in this journey from beginning right through the end, where, we had our design groups, and it was beautiful that our students were part of, for example, reimagining our high schools. That's where we are now. We have pathways, college and career pathways, that were clearly innovated with students not only at the center of the process, but driving the design. It was unforgettable. And then the pandemic happened. And so now, as I think about moving forward, how can I leverage some of those learnings as we think about the next level of redesign?
As you were considering closing schools, it sounds like this was a board action. You were directed to do it. You grew up in Hartford, as I recall. And so here is a large city known for its finance and insurance. I think about the history of Hartford and the ebb and flow of any metropolitan community and metropolitan district. And so I imagine you had some aging buildings. You also had declining enrollment in some areas. And you were trying to your point, create the very best experience for children. And that's difficult when you have low enrollment in certain schools. You're not able to provide the same kind of programming and those types of things. And so before I ask you sort of what got overlooked, can you take a step back and just tell us a little bit about what were some of the decisions on, why were you closing schools? What goes on in a some districts are growing, some are not. And so how was that decision made?
So certainly some of the conditions, of course, the enrollment. We happen to have an ecosystem of school choice, and with declining enrollment, not just in the city, but also in the majority of the municipalities across the state of Connecticut, right? They have declining enrollment. And so you put that together with a flat funding, historical flat funding, you add a deeper level of need that continues to increase, given that we do still have some communities that have traditionally been underserved. And you put all of those together, and we do have a system in which we were not meeting students' needs well. And one of the things that I found when we did the deep dive is families told us that safety was a concern for them. Safety, when we think about just the safety that's on everyone's mind. Are our schools safe in terms of, for example, security, culture and climate, that safety? But the other side of safety, the way our families were interpreting that was that they did not feel secure in their choice for their child's school. And by that, I mean that they did not have a secure pathway. They chose an elementary school, but they were not sure what it would mean for middle and high school. Because we have an ecosystem of school choice, there were so many options, there was misalignment. And so we had to create pathways for our families. And so that was another reason why we had to really take a step back, lay everything out, and identify ways that we can cohere the system for those choices that we wanted our families to have. And there was one piece there that was often overlooked when we were unpacking the data, and that was the student experience from the developmental side, where at the middle school, for example, we were not able, because of those small enrollment numbers across our middle schools, we could not provide a true middle school experience for our students. Those were significant inequities, especially when we think about what they need at that time in their development.
And when you think about the middle school experience, for those who are not totally familiar, there are some people who are listening to the podcast who say, hey, I'd really like you to tell us a little bit more about that. So a middle experience in terms of how it is defined in Hartford is that the exploratory, to have access to music and choir and the sciences and STEM sort of related fields and all of those pieces.
Absolutely. And we weren't at the adult level. We weren't able to provide all of our middle school educators ample time to learn from and each other, right? We know that's that's adult learning in action. So we weren't able to do that because of the small numbers from a resource allocation perspective. Perfect. And so we had to do deep learning with not only internally, but with our families as to what does resource allocation look, sound, and feel like.
So I'm going to take us a step back here and say, okay, so you're closing schools. You were absolutely mining the wisdom of your community, really getting a sense of what was important to them. And that took time. And so you had the wisdom to say, we're going to do this with intentionality, where we have a sense of urgency, but that's not going to mean that we're going to do this in such a way that it feels as if it's being shoved down anyone's throats. As a community, you want to know, and everybody wants to understand the why. When you're looking back, what was overlooked?
Oh, the 3 year, it took us 3 years and we maintained the integrity of that. I had a unique context here in which I had lots of churn on the board side. So I just completed my 6 years as superintendent. I've had 5 board chairs, for example, just to give you some context. And we were able to maintain the integrity. And what got overlooked, I would say, is the opportunity, some opportunities to, again, step back as I was, having new leadership on the board and also new leadership in the community, right? This is a transient community. And so having to, for 3 years, missing the opportunity to pause as the years went by to say, so this is a plan that we collectively designed. Here's what it will mean for the next year. We did it, but we could always do more and do it better.
Yeah, so like every few months or so, treating it almost like your favorite TV show where it says previously on, it's sort of like bringing everyone back to how did we get here, those types of things. What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed?
Trust, and that you have to slow down to engage and build the relationships so that you can go faster. Some relationships, some deeper relationships that were cultivated, relationships and partnerships with our faith-based leaders, even deeper ones than the ones that I had coming in with our higher ed providers. I mean, we did research as part of the initial work to determine the role that higher ed could play, and the fact that our students 2 years after they were leaving us and enrolling weren't persisting to the degree that we wanted them to. And so we needed higher ed to come under the tent to help figure that out with us. And so deeper partnerships, more meaningful and intentional partnership as well. Same thing with our funders who have been at the ready and shoulder to shoulder with us. But it was, again, deeper learning and deeper work for all of us.
I imagine also your relationship with local government probably also improved or deepened, because you always have a relationship with the government. But I was noticing when we introduced you that you play these roles on the governor and the mayor, and that it's a highly political decision to have to close schools. It's a highly political position to be a superintendent in a major city in the United States. And so I imagine those relationships had to be navigated carefully.
Very much so. And because we operate within an ecosystem of school choice in response to, a stipulated agreement to integrate learning experiences for students, there was also a dynamic that I had to mine, and a relationship that had to be cultivated and sustained with at the state level. But when I reflect on it all, I am most grateful for those partnerships, because when we fast forward and we were in the pandemic, it was all so seamless for us to just reach out and almost just continue to operate in partnership, and always seeking to further cohere and improve the way of work.
That's an important piece for those listening, is that, you make decisions with people, you make decisions with the people most impacted by that decision. And as you're building relationships through these decisions, that there's a absolute ripple effect for decisions down the road that you don't even know are coming. So that's really interesting. What frustrated you?
What frustrated me through that specific process was the lack of understanding at that time as to the deep level of need, the complexity, and the perception or misunderstanding that, well, you're an urban school system, you get a lot of money already. What are you doing with the money? You get more than X. Or the other one that I kept hearing, and I still hear it, is, well, you have declining enrollment, so you should need less resources. And I kept saying, well, that's exactly what we're learning, that just because, right, there's less, that we have less students, the need further deepens and concentrates, and that becomes even harder to plan and to support and to deliver on. So that was frustrating. There is still a level of frustration there. And then, I have to think about frustration around making sure that as a collective, that we continue to change the minds and ultimately the hearts of all of the adults that play a role in supporting our young people internally. And then because we are a community that is so, with all of these interdependencies, that the external stakeholders understand that as well.
That's interesting also because I think of, what is it? The Mark Twain home is in Hartford, right? Anytime I fly into the Hartford airport, I see a Lego version of it. So, but I'm thinking to myself, there has been such significant change in Hartford, and that to help people recognize how they were socialized, how things have changed, and how we need to do better in terms of how do we support our young people who are having a very different experience potentially than they had as young children in Hartford. That has to be incredibly frustrating because that takes a lot of time. What could you have done differently?
Ton of things. I will tell you that I
well, just choose one. Because I already learned that you wake up at 3 a.m. and you think, what could I have done differently? So
I will tell you that I would have leveraged student voice even more. Students were alongside of me at times, co-facilitating some of the community conversations. They were clearly part of the design. They had a part in the budget formula and framework that we developed to support the plan as we were consolidating and aiming for financial sustainability. But I think that we could have done more with our students to give them additional opportunity to be part of a policy. Decisions that were also being made at a deeper level, that, we could have leveraged students to be leaders with the younger students, the elementary piece and the early middle school grades. I think there was a missed opportunity there to leverage voice.
In the end, what was something that was good that came out of this work?
I will tell you some of the conversations with families and even with some teachers or emails and letters that I've received that said, Superintendent, as I reflect back and I didn't agree with you then, I see it now. And it is so great to walk into, for example, some of the new facilities and the learning spaces that we were able to co-create together and celebrate and hear from our amazing educators, from our leaders, from our partners and our students. This is great. This is what matters to us, and right, we see it in the learning experiences that our students are happening. That's a great thing.
My guest again today was Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez. Leslie, thank you so much for being on the program. But I know Hartford means so much to you. You graduated from the Hartford Public Schools, and you're quoted as saying, in retrospect, boy, there were some glaring inequities in the district that I went to and that now I serve. What makes you special is your actions show you're doing something about it. And so thank you so much for your time. I'm really grateful for it.
Thank you so much for having me and for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit of my voice.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader. Leadership in After Action.